Hello Flight Simmers, and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this lesson we'll finally talk about getting from point A to point B and learn about VFR navigation techniques. This lesson will be the first in a series on VFR navigation techniques. We'll do an overview of techniques you can use to navigate VFR and then take the first leg of a cross-country flight to demonstrate one of these techniques. There are two broad categories of navigation techniques you can use when you navigate in VFR conditions: visual navigation and electronic navigation. Visual navigation techniques include pilotage and dead reckoning. Electronic navigation techniques include VOR navigation, NDB navigation, and area navigation, or RNAV, which these days pretty much means using a global positioning system, or GPS. In this video and the one that follows it, we'll be focusing mostly on visual navigation techniques. This lesson will focus primarily on pilotage, and the next one will focus primarily on dead reckoning. There will be lessons following those that will focus on electronic navigation techniques. So let's do a brief overview of our visual navigation techniques. Pilotage is the technique of using visual landmarks to navigate. This can be something as simple as following a road, railroad, or river, or even a large lake. Pilots often jokingly refer to it as flying IFR, where IFR means I follow roads, or rivers, or railroads. An example of this technique would be if I were to take off out of the Fort Smith area and want to fly to the east. I can easily follow the Arkansas River here, or Interstate 40, or stay in between them and hit any one of these airports on the way down to the southeast, all the way down to Little Rock. And in fact, if I continue heading to the southeast on the river, I will eventually find Pine Bluff down there. Another example is if I were to take off out of some of the Northwest Arkansas area airports like Bentonville or Rogers or Springdale and head to the northeast, I can then follow this series of lakes that's interconnected here and make it into the Branson area, or keep following those to the east and make it over to the Mountain Home area airports over here. In Flight Simulator, it's pretty easy to follow major interstates, large rivers, or large bodies of water such as lakes or things like that. Secondary roads and railroads are not as easy to find or identify or navigate by, and following power lines or pipelines can be difficult unless they cut through long swaths of forested areas, which it's hard to tell if they do that or not on the charts. Dead reckoning is navigating using computations of direction, time, speed, and distance. It involves plotting a course line, creating checkpoints along the route, and making calculations for time, speed, distance, and wind correction to ensure you stay on course. This is actually the technique that's been used by sailors for centuries to cross oceans, and it's still a valid navigation technique today. In this lesson, and the one that follows it, we will conduct a 3-segment VFR cross-country flight. 2 segments will be a little more than 50 nautical miles, and the middle one about 90 nautical miles. You don't have to fly all 3 segments, but I would encourage you to fly at least the first 2, as each one uses one of the visual navigation techniques we'll be talking about. Often you'll use a combination of the navigation techniques. The first segment we'll fly, the one covered in this video, will be a flight from Pine Bluff to Greenville, Mississippi. We'll plot a course and fly a heading to get there, but we'll also have the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers in sight during the entire flight. As long as we keep them in sight, we shouldn't get lost, and we really don't need to time the checkpoints on this leg. The second leg will be a flight from Greenville to Camden, Arkansas. This leg will be our dead reckoning leg, as there's not much in the way of landmarks for us to follow. Again, we'll plot a course, mark some checkpoints, and we'll actually time between checkpoints to see how accurate we are. The final leg, from Camden back to Pine Bluff, you can again combine the techniques, though you'll probably be relying a little more on dead reckoning than pilotage. There's a road we can follow, but it's not a major one, so we'll again plot a course and make some checkpoints. We'll also take a look at the flight planner in Flight Simulator and discuss how to use that. And we'll take a look at the VFR map. Using the flight planner and the VFR map is probably the simplest way to navigate in Flight Simulator, as it basically gives you a GPS type moving map and a navlog. I'll also mention that SkyVector has a flight planning utility in it. To access that, go to the flight plan bar right below the SkyVector logo there and click on that, and that'll bring up the flight planning box. Just like most plans, you'll enter a departure and a destination, and when you do that, it will put a course line on there, and it will tell you the magnetic heading and the distance on that course. And it will give you a distance down here. It will also give you a time and route, but be aware that that time and route is based on current or forecast winds, so that will be different than it is in Flight Simulator. If you're not using real world weather, if you have calm winds, that will be different. You can also add checkpoints, which is something we're going to do for our Dead Reckoning leg. There's two ways to add them. You can either come in here and type them in. So say if I want to add the Dumas Airport in there, it's 0 Mike 0 is the identifier. You can just type that in there, 0 Mike 0, and that will put that in there for me as a checkpoint. And then it gives me the course and distance between our checkpoints. I can also do it by right-clicking on the course line. So I'll put one right here, about where our top of descent would be, right by this river bend down here. And it brings up a box, and I can choose any of these things to add to the plan. And I will use the GPS coordinate because that should be the closest to where I clicked. And that adds a point. You can see it's 16 miles away. 15 nautical miles was our top of descent, so that's pretty close. So that tells me our top of descent is going to be right by this river bend here. And then again, it breaks it down into the distance between the segments there. There's also a little mini navlog here that gives you the points that you have in there. So to get from Pine Bluff to Dumas Airport, it's a course of 131. The routing is direct. It's not an airway or anything like that. And the distance is 26.5 nautical miles. And again, this en route time that they give us here is based on the current or forecast winds for the time that you have in there, so that may not be accurate. We'll want to make our own calculations there. But it gives you that for each leg of the flight. So that's another way that you can look and see what your course should be on each leg of your flight and what the distances are. Now let's take a look at the Flight Simulator Flight Planner. So before we get going on the Flight Planner, we're going to change one of the settings in the Assistance menu. We're going to take some of the training wheels off for this flight and turn off the auto mixture settings so we can learn how to lean the mixture in flight. So go to Options, and then go to Assistance, and then Aircraft Systems, and then turn the auto mixture setting to off. And this again will enable us to learn how to properly lean an engine in cruise flight on a general aviation piston engine aircraft. So to access the flight planner and the map, we want to go to World Map, just like we've done to set up all of our previous flights, and that gives us this global map here. And then you can control what you see and don't see on the map with the filters. You can see all these little white dots here are things that the map is displaying, and if we zoom in close enough, we can actually see what they are. These are airports or landmarks or things like that, and then you can control what's on there and what is not on there through the filters. So let's go ahead and take a look at the filter settings. The top menu up here is your map layers basically, and the top one is the kind of the base default map layer. You have a couple different options. One is satellite, so it shows a satellite picture of the Earth. But you'll notice if we zoom down into about a regional level, it gets to where it doesn't have a whole lot of detail, so it's not of a lot of use. You can also do what they call an IFR map, which is basically land masses and large bodies of water plus any of the details that you've chosen to show. So that's what they call the IFR map. And then we have the blend map, which starts with a satellite map, but then when you get to that kind of regional level where things are not very detailed, it goes into transitions into that IFR map. And that's the default, and I really don't see any reason not to use that. You get a good overview of terrain and whatnot at the high level, and then as you zoom in and you get to that kind of fuzzy layer, then you can get rid of that and just see the IFR. The weather layer turns on clouds if you want to see the clouds, or if you want to see a radar image of precipitation, you can see that as well. And if you just want a nice clean map like this, then you want to turn the this weather layer to off. You can also set this in the general menu in the data settings. You can set live weather to off, and that's another way that you get this nice clean map with no clouds. So those are the two different ways to do that. The wind effect will give you basically a heat map of the winds as they currently exist if you have the live weather turned on. I don't, so right now it's showing 0 everywhere, so you have an option to see kind of a heat map of the ground, and then low-level winds, which I'm assuming goes up probably to about 18 or 24,000, and then the high-level winds. They don't give you any sort of information as to what the colors on the heat map stand for. You just kind of have to guess at that. And then you have the option to show your friends or not, and then an option to show third-party content. If you've installed any custom landmarks or airports, bought them through the marketplace or got them on a website, you can see those. And the third-party content is denoted with this little plugin symbol here. So if you see that next to an airport, you know it's got some sort of third-party content or add-on content in there. So the next layer down is our airport layer, and the top one that just says airport turns all airports on or off on the map. So you see if I click that off, all that's left is landmarks and cities. And if I turn it back on, we get all of the runways. And then below that you have more specific airport types that you can choose to display. So it's hard surface, grass runways, water runways. It doesn't seem to have any snowy runways, and I don't know if that's a feature of live weather. It does have dirt runways, heliports. There don't seem to be any in Flight Simulator, at least not that I have found. And other, I'm not sure if that turns off or on custom content. When I do that, all that disappears is Dallas. So I'm not sure what exactly they consider other. But this is handy for if you want to look for a particular type of runway. Say if you're looking for a grass runway to do some soft field practice on. You can turn off everything but the grass runways, and whatever is left over, you'd also want to turn off the landmarks, is going to be a grass runway. So you can go out there, and then you can zoom in to the actual airports and see which runway that you want to use. You can also zoom in a little tighter, and you can actually see kind of a runway layout as well. And all of these runway symbols are the same sort of symbol that you would see on a sectional chart with the circle and the tick marks. That's how it displays an airport. But that's kind of a handy menu feature to use, like I said, if you're looking for a specific type of airport. Usually what I leave it on, if I'm doing just a normal flight, is I will turn on hard surface runways, and pretty much leave everything else off, because I'm not going to use, if I'm not going to use grass runways, I don't need that. I'm not going to use a water runway on a 152. Like I said, I don't even know if it displays snowy runways right now. I'm not going to use a dirt runway, and obviously I can't land at a heliport. So I just turn the hard surface ones on, and then you can see all the hard surface runways that you can use on the map. So the next layer down after that is what they call points of interest, and points of interest are denoted with these little map tack type symbols, and they're divided up into landmarks, cities, and fauna. And landmarks are things like Hoover Dam and El Capitan out in Yosemite, and points of interest that they have on simulators, so you can know where they are and know how to find those and go look at those. And then the cities are, most of your major cities like Austin and then San Antonio. They do have some of the smaller cities on here too. But generally, if it's a mid-sized city, it's going to be on there, though you might have to zoom in to see the city name. And then fauna, they don't seem to have any. That's just animals, and they don't seem to have any out there. But if they were on here, you could, see that on the map as well. And what I'll typically do is I'll turn landmarks off. I don't really need to see those. I do keep the cities on, so I can see kind of the major geographical locations on the map, and then I will turn fauna off since it doesn't seem to be there anyway. So the last layer that we control on the map is navigation, which includes airspace, nav aids, and fixes or position reports. And so let's turn the airspace layer on and take a look at that. It's very generalized on this map. If you zoom in, you have to zoom in fairly tight to see it. And then at this level, basically we're seeing air traffic control sectors here, and then you can see the Memphis Class B here. And then we can zoom in a little bit tighter still, and we see the Little Rock Class C and the Air Force Base Class D, and then Class E airspace that goes to the ground. The problem is with this map is the airspace is very generalized. Generally speaking, the yellow is going to be general use airspace or general controlled airspace, but it doesn't tell you specifically what it is, whether it's C or D or E, so it's hard to tell from this map. And then the red is generally going to be special use airspace, so that's going to be things like restricted areas or prohibited areas, warning areas, places that you generally in real life are going to want to stay out of. The problem is that they also code the military areas or color the military areas as yellow, military operations areas as yellow as well. So really from this map, it's hard to tell what airspace is and whether or not you should avoid it. So really you need to go to a site like SkyVector and use some sort of a chart for your route if you're trying to avoid real-life airspace. So the next layer we can control is the nav aids. So we'll turn the airspace off and go with the nav aids. And you can see what this does is it turns on things like VORs, NDBs, and localizer courses for ILSs. So you can see those and use those in your flight planning. So you can see the VOR symbol, actually the VOR DME symbol is used for the VORs. It's also used for the localizers. So we can see the Little Rock VOR just to the southeast of the airport there, and then all four of their localizers for their ILSs are also listed there. List the identifier when you hover over it, and then they've got their NDB, the locator outer marker there for 4 left as well. So that shows what those are, and again, you can use those as waypoints on your flight planning if you want to. And then the last thing is fixes or position reports, and if you turn that on, you'll notice how the dots proliferate quite a bit. And you do have to zoom in really tight to be able to see these. And the triangles are traditional fixes or intersections or reporting points, whatever you want to call them. Those are things that are either on airways or they're on a traditional VOR or ILS type instrument approach. And then the star type symbols are GPS reporting points. So the only way you can typically identify those is using a GPS. So those are there, and those are handy in using for flight planning as well if you want to route yourself around airspace or away from water or something like that. You can put one of those in there as a waypoint on your flight plan. All right, so let's talk about building a flight plan now. All right, so to build a flight plan, we want to start by doing the aircraft stuff just like we always do for every lesson. So you want to go in here and do your weight and balance and give yourself 2 full tanks of gas just like we always do. Set up any other aircraft options that you want and then go back out. And we start the flight plan by selecting a origination point. I will go ahead and select Pine Bluff and I will do runway 18. If you want to start on the ramp, that's fine if you're wanting to go through the ground routine. And I'll mention that when you do an origin point, you can set up on a runway, which will put you on the runway, configured for takeoff with your engines running and with a clearance if you need one at a towered airport. Or you can pick a ramp or a gate, and that will start you at that position with the aircraft in a cold and dark state if you want to go through engine startup and the run-up, taxi, all that sort of stuff. You can also pick a point other than an airport. You could pick a VOR or a landmark or a city or an intersection. And if you do that, Flight Simulator will start you in the air. It will start you at about 1,500 feet AGL. So that's another option if you want to get flying real quick. You can do that. But for the purposes of cross-country flying, we will start with an airport and go from there. You notice when I enter the origination point in here, the from point, it draws a circle around wherever I've put that origination airport, and this represents your aircraft's approximate range in a 0 wind condition. And you can even see that if I go into the weight and balance here, and we can kind of see the circle underneath on the translucency here, and if I put the fuel down, that actually shrinks that circle. So that is your aircraft's range in a 0 wind condition with the fuel, whatever fuel load you have aboard. So that's kind of a handy thing for seeing how far your aircraft can fly. Okay, so the next step in the flight planning is to add your arrival airport. So our first leg is going to be to Greenville, Mississippi. So I will do Kilo Golf Lima Hotel and enter that and click on that. And then just like with the arrival airport, we can choose a runway or point on the airport that we want to go to. So I'll use 18 right, will be my preferred runway of landing today. And once you select your airport, it will automatically generate a VFR direct GPS route for you. So it's going direct from Pine Bluff down to Greenville. And it tells us the mileage and the time to fly it in this aircraft on the flight plan here, or on the route line, the course line. And then we can actually go over here to this box here and modify what type of flight plan, VFR, IFR, and what type of routing. I recommend doing direct GPS if you're needing a VFR flight plan. VOR to VOR usually routes you pretty circuitously. You could really go from Pine Bluff VOR straight to Greenville VOR, but it takes you all the way down to Monticello down there. So I don't recommend doing that. If you need to do an IFR flight plan, if you're in IFR flight planning, you can choose low altitude airways or high altitude airways, and it will route you that way. But if you would rather do a direct route, you can go in and you can actually click on each fix and then remove it, and that will get you back to a direct routing. But really for VFR, the easiest thing is just to do a direct GPS routing. Once you get the routing in there, you can modify the flight plan by adding any fix that you would like to. So let's talk about how to do that. Okay, so once I've generated that course, I can add pretty much anything that is displayed on here as a white dot as a fix on my flight plan, or add that into my flight plan. So we've got our course line generated here. I'm going to zoom in here. And I see that Billy Free Municipal 0 Mike 0 in Dumas, Arkansas files pretty much directly on my course between Pine Bluff and Greenville. If I left click on that, it gives me the usual options, but it also gives me an option to add. So I click Add, and that adds that into my flight plan. So now you see Pine Bluff to Billy Free and then to Greenville. And that will add that into my navlog as well. And then when I actually start the flight, it will be in the navlog in the game and on the moving map. And doing something like that, adding a point that's on your route, does something like adding a checkpoint. So that's kind of nice, and it'll give you the distance between those fixes, so you can kind of tell, if you're on course and if you're running on your time estimates, if you're doing dead reckoning. If you want to pull that off, all you have to do is left click on it again and then click remove, and it will take it out of the flight plan. You can also use this for doing things like if you do not want to fly a course that's a straight line. If you want to fly to a point and then change course and fly to another point, you can do that. An example of why you would do that is to avoid airspace, military airspace, or restricted areas. If you're trying to be realistic and see what a flight would look like in the real world, or if you want to avoid like a long over water route in a single engine airplane, where in the real world you would have to carry life vests and overwater equipment, you can see if you can do a routing that would stay a little closer to shore. Let's do an example of that real quick. So we'll click Apalachicola and set that as our departure airport. And then we'll go to Sarasota Airport, which is KSRQ, down in southern Florida there. Use 1-4, why not? And you can see that route has a pretty good stretch that is pretty far away from land. It's probably more than power off gliding distance from shore, and in the real world, if you do that, you're going to have to carry life vests and that sort of stuff. So we can change that routing by zooming in and finding a point that we want to fly to. I'm going to use Cross City Airport, kind of in where the Panhandle meets the peninsula there. So I'll click Add that, and now it has us doing leg over to Cross City and then changing course and going down to Sarasota, which looks like it keeps us pretty much within power and gliding distance of shore, which is a little nicer for a single engine airplane. So that's another way you can use that feature. The one thing that I would say about using that feature is that you generally want to pick your airports or your points in the order they would occur in the flight plan. If you pick your airport and your other airport, it draws a straight line, and then you pick a point here and then like a point down here, but then pick a point in the middle, it'll go here, here, and then here sometimes, and then down to your airport. So it'll kind of send you on a wild goose chase to try to kind of get to your airport. Another little trick you can use with this feature is to give yourself a nice long straight-in final at your airport of landing, or even build yourself a traffic pattern. One of the things that's kind of handy is most of the airports nowadays have a GPS approach, at least one, more than likely more than one if it has more than one way, that lines you up straight in for that runway. And so you can take a look at the approach plate for the GPS approach to the runway you want to land on, and find the final approach fix, which if you look at the side view with the glide path vertical planning information in there, it has a cross at one of the intersections. We call that the Maltese cross, and that is the final approach fix for that runway. And what you can do is take a look at that intersection, like in Greenville, for the GPS approach to 18 right. The final approach fix is a Jeho. And then go and find that in Flight Simulator, zoom in kind of tight, and then there's a Jeho just to the north of the airport there. Left click on that and add that, and as you can see, that gives you a nice long, about 4 or 5 straight in final for runway 18 right there in Greenville. So you can do that really for any airport that has a GPS approach or even ILS approach. There's typically a fix about 4 or 5 miles out that you can use. Just look for the fix that's lined up from the runway about that amount of distance out, and add that, and it gives you a nice long straight in. As you're editing your flight plan, you can access the navlog by clicking on this blue navlog button that's just below flight conditions. If you click on that, it will bring up a vertical profile that is not necessarily accurate. You can see it gives us the cruise is basically the top of climb, and the descent is the top of descent, but you can see this doesn't really jive with what the time, speed, and distance to climb chart said. That's way too long for a 152 to get to 5,500 feet. You can also change your cruise altitude up here, so go ahead and change that to 5,500 feet. But that's not really, especially if you're not using ATC, it's not really something you need to worry about in a VFR flight plan. You can go to whatever altitude you like to go to. So the vertical information is not that accurate. We'll talk about vertical planning here in just a little bit. But it does give you each of the waypoints that you've put in there, along with those cruise and descent waypoints. And then it gives you the heading that you'll want to use to fly between this waypoint and this waypoint. So you get from Pine Bluff down to Dumas. It's a heading of about 130 degrees. It gives you the distance, so it's 26 miles. 5,500 feet is where you'll be vertically. If you have a VOR or an NDB, it'll put the frequency in there for you. It will give you an estimate of your, I assume that's ground speed or maybe true airspeed. Probably ground speed. I think it takes into account the winds, which, again, may or may not be accurate. And then it will give you the time between those two waypoints based on that speed. So that is your navlog. You can access your navlog in flight by clicking on the compass icon in the custom toolbar, and then the navlog that you access in flight also comes with a stopwatch at the bottom for you to time between your checkpoints on a dead reckoning leg. And to get back out of the navlog, just click on the navlog again, and you can go back to editing your flight plan. Once you've finished editing your flight plan, you do want to go back and set up the flight conditions just like we've always done. Again, I would choose a June day. You can vary the departure time if you want to. If you want to start a little earlier in the day, but I'm going to go ahead and set it up at noon for the lighting. And even with the 3 legs, that should be in time to get us home by dark. We'll set up the temperature at 25 degrees C to make it somewhat realistic for the season, and we'll take off that wind layer, but again, it's probably going to add it back in there, and we'll have to delete it again once we load up the flight if we want a 0 wind condition. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and click on Fly. And once you do that, once you've finished editing the flight plan and click on Fly, the flight simulator will automatically upload the flight plan to your VFR map for the 152. And if you're in an aircraft that is equipped with either a GPS or an FMS, it would also load the flight plan into that as well. So your flight plan will be preloaded in there as well. If you want to use your VFR map in flight, just go up to your toolbar and click on the icon that looks like a folded map, and that will bring up your VFR map. It is oriented north up, just like navigational charts and most of the GPS moving map receivers that are in the program. It shows your aircraft and its orientation on the course it's currently heading on. And it also shows your course if you have a flight plan in there. If you have a multi-leg flight plan, it shows the first leg, or the leg you're currently on, in magenta, and the subsequent legs in white. It depicts water, such as oceans, lakes, rivers. It depicts terrain in the same sort of color scheme as a sectional chart does. It depicts airports and nav aids such as VORs and NDBs, and then it depicts some airspace and also roads on there. The VORs and the airports are labeled with their identifiers, and the waypoints that you have in your flight plan are also labeled, but nothing else that's on the chart is labeled. The detail that you get on the map also is dependent on how much you zoom in. You can zoom in and out using your mouse scroll wheel, and the further you zoom in, the more airports and things like that are going to pop up, and the more terrain detail. So you can toggle your GPS tracking on the map by this slider switch that's on the bottom right here. If you've got a blue button with a gray background, that means that the GPS tracking is off. And then if you toggle it over to the right side here, you see the whole thing turns blue, and that turns on your GPS tracking. When the GPS tracking is active, that puts your aircraft in the center of the map, and the map moves with the aircraft. And if you zoom in and out while your GPS tracking is on, it keeps the aircraft in the center. You can also pan around the map if you want to look at different areas. You just left click on the map and then drag it, and you'll notice when I do that, it turns the GPS tracking off. And then if I turn the GPS tracking back on, it centers the aircraft back up on the map. The left-hand side here is a toggle for an isoline map. Basically what this does is it puts contour lines on the map, and in order to see that, I have to scroll out to an area that has terrain. So it gives you a little more visibility in areas where terrain changes rapidly, and if you go way out to the west where there's a lot of terrain, you can see it's a fairly useful feature out there, but it's not very useful really in flatland areas. I typically don't use it a whole lot. So navigating with the VFR map is pretty straightforward, especially if you've got a flight plan in there. All you have to do is keep your aircraft on the magenta line. As it's north up, that can sometimes cause some confusion. If your aircraft is pointed south, things will be a little backwards for you. If you turn to the right, the aircraft is going to go this way because that's a right-hand turn for the aircraft when it's pointed to the south. So things will look a little bit backwards, but other than that, just keep your aircraft pointed on the magenta line and you'll eventually get to your destination. If you want to know what heading you need to fly to stay on the magenta line, once you're on there, you can pull up your navlog, and the navlog will give you, just like it did in the previous or in the pre-flight menu, it'll give you your first fix, it will give you the name of the fix, and it'll give you the heading to get from your point of origination to the next fix. So it's 130 degrees is what we need to fly to stay centered on this line. And then once we get to 0 Mike 0, then we'll take up a heading of 123, and that will take us to a Ajejo intersection, which is on the final there for the runway in Greenville. And then once we're lined up on final, the heading to fly, the final approach is 179. It also gives you the distance and, again, an estimation of your time. And, again, you've got a stopwatch down here that you can start, and it'll count up for you. You can pause it, and then you can reset it back to 0. So we'll use that on the dead reckoning leg. Before we hop in the aircraft and take off, let's talk about a few more things. The first thing is fuel planning. The book says that the 152 burns about 5 gallons of gas per hour of flying, and I have tested that out in Flight Simulator, and it does seem to be about what it burns in Flight Simulator, assuming you've properly leaned the engine. That also assumes that you're running at a cruise RPM of about 2,300 RPM. You can run the engine a little faster, up to about 2,500 RPM is allowed by the Pilot Operation Handbook, and that will get you another 5 to 10 knots of airspeed in cruise. But you need to bump up your fuel burn assumptions if you do that to about 6 gallons per hour. In Flight Simulator, you get 28 gallons of fuel, but just like in the real aircraft, about a gallon in each side is not considered usable fuel. It will not drain out of the tanks in flight. In fact, when you get down to 1 gallon in each tank, the engine will quit. So you actually have about 26 gallons of what is considered usable fuel. At a burn rate of 5 gallons an hour, that gives us an endurance of just a little over 5 hours. And endurance is how much time the aircraft can fly. But you had better be rolling into the ramp when that 5 hours is up, because your engine is about to quit. And assuming a true airspeed of about 95 knots, that gives us a range on the 152, or how far the aircraft can fly, of about 475 nautical miles, assuming a zero wind condition. Of course, it wouldn't be smart to fly the aircraft until the engine is about to quit from fuel starvation. It's wise to have a little extra fuel in case you need to do a go-around or divert to a different airport that's a little farther away. In fact, the FAA liked this idea so much they made a rule for it. When you're flying VFR, you need enough fuel to fly to the first point of intended landing, assuming a normal cruise speed, and then fly thereafter for 30 minutes during the day and 45 minutes at night. And most pilots in the real world, I think, use a 45-minute reserve as a bare minimum, and most wise pilots add a little extra cushion on top of this. So with those FAA required reserves, and again, I'm using the 45-minute reserve here, that gives us an endurance on the airplane of about 4 hours and 15 minutes and a range of about 405 nautical miles, again, assuming no wind. The airplane also takes a little more fuel for start, taxi, run-up, takeoff, and climb. So here are the numbers from the book for time, fuel, and distance to climb. To give you an idea of how much fuel and time and distance you're going to cover getting to your cruise altitude. I did include the roughly 1 gallon of gas you're going to need for start, run-up, and taxi that's included in the book. So let's take a look at a fuel calculation example of how much fuel we're going to need. The first thing we need to do is determine how much fuel we're going to burn on a leg of a cross-country flying. So the way we do that is we take the leg length. So our first leg from Pine Bluff to Greenville is 63 nautical miles. We take our ground speed, which is 95 knots. And so we divide 63 divided by 95, which gives us 0.66 hours, which is about 40 minutes of flying time. And so we multiply that 0.66 times our 5 gallons that we're going to burn in an hour. And we come up with an en route fuel burn, or a fuel burn for that leg, of about 3.4 gallons. So that's how much we're going to burn once we get to cruise, getting from Pine Bluff down to Greenville. And then to determine how much fuel we actually need on the aircraft, we want to take the en route fuel burn, so 3.4 gallons. We want to take the climb fuel from our time, fuel, and distance to climb chart, which was 2.2 gallons to get to 5,500 feet. And then we want to take our FAA fuel reserve. So if we take 45 minutes or 0.75 hours and multiply that times 5, we come up with 3.8 gallons. And we also need to remember that there's going to be 2 gallons in the tank that we can't use. So we need to add that in there. And if we add all those numbers up, we come into our minimum fuel that we need on the airplane to legally fly from Pine Bluff down to Greenville is going to be 11.4 gallons. Now, with fuel planning in the 152, again, there's no reason that you can't carry a full load of fuel, because you can carry a full load of fuel in 2 good-sized adults, so you can carry pretty much the max payload the airplane can carry. So there's really no reason not to top it off. Fuel planning in the 152 is more about having an awareness of how long we can fly before we need more gas, or maybe how many legs we can do before we're starting to push the limits of our endurance and our range. I'll also mention that in general aviation aircraft, it's very hard to load fuel this specifically. If you have 11.4 gallons that you need divided by 2 tanks, that's 5.7 gallons. But if you tell the fueler when he rolls up to your aircraft in the real world that I need you to fuel me to 5.7 gallons in each tank, he's going to look at you like you're crazy because there's no way for him to determine that. So what most people do is just make an estimation, and oftentimes there's marks in the tank that specify a certain amount of gas, and most fuelers are familiar. Sometimes they'll have X's or in the tanks or little tabs. So a lot of times guys will just tell it, fill it to the X's or fill it to the tabs because they know they have X amount of gallons when they fill it up that much. And again, in the 152, you don't need to not top it off. It's a good idea to have a full tanks on every leg. But when you get to aircraft like the 172, you can't carry 4 people and a full load of fuel. So that's where you want to start making fuel calculations to say, well, how much gas do I actually need to fly this leg? And then you can fuel to that so you can maximize your payload. The other thing we want to talk about before we take off is cruise altitudes and how we select them. If you're flying VFR, there are certain altitudes that are available to you for cruise altitudes. And those altitudes run from above 3,000 feet AGL up to 17,500 feet MSL. And they are based on your magnetic course. If you're headed generally in an easterly direction, a magnetic course of 360 clockwise around to a magnetic course of 179, your cruise altitude should be odd 1,000 feet plus 500 feet. So you're going to use altitudes like 3,500, 5,500, 7,500. And those are altitudes MSL or above mean sea level, not AGL. If you're using a magnetic course of 180 clockwise around to 359, or generally heading westbound, then you are going to use an altitude, an even 1,000-foot altitude plus 500 feet. So those are going to be altitudes like 4,500, 6,500, 8,500. If you're wondering why you don't use just the plain thousands of feet, that's because like 4,000, 6,000, 5,000, that's because those altitudes are reserved for pilots flying on IFR flight plans or instrument flight plans. So there's a little bit of altitude separation built into the system automatically just based on the type of flight that you're flying and which direction you're going. As far as selecting your cruise altitude, there's a number of factors you want to consider when you make a decision on what cruise altitude you're going to go to. One is distance. Obviously, if you're going on a relatively short flight, you're not going to have enough distance to get up to a very high cruise altitude and then come back down. You're going to spend a fair amount of time in the terminal area descending in a circle to get back down. So there's not a lot of point of going up really high if it's a short flight. And we'll do some numbers on that here in a second and take a look at how that works out. You also want to consider the wind. It might be worth your trouble to climb up to a higher cruise altitude if you're going to get a nice strong tailwind when you get there and get there a little bit faster. It can offset the amount of time that you're flying slower in the climb. Another thing is you want to consider weather, and there's all sorts of things to consider here. If you have a cloud deck that's up at 7,000 feet, then you're not going to be able to go to 7,500 feet. So that's going to have an effect on your cruise altitude. Also, in real life, you're going to consider the ride. If the ride is really bumpy up high, you may decide to stay down low and be a little slower and burn a little more gas just to get a more pleasant ride. And oftentimes it's usually the reverse of that. If you can get up higher, your ride is going to be better once you get above the terrain and the mechanical turbulence it causes. Visibility is also a factor, especially in the summertime. A lot of times you'll get a haze layer, and if you can get up above that haze layer, you're going to have better visibility. You won't be able to see the ground any better, but you can see other aircraft a little bit better. And then, of course, equipment is going to play a big role in how high you can go. Obviously, in the 152, we're not going to go up to 17,500. The airplane is just not going to make it. And there are certain altitudes that it performs better at, so we're going to pick one of those altitudes. But if you have something like the TBM 930 that can hop right on up into the teens, that's something that's worth looking at. So let's talk a little bit about how to determine our top of descent, or when we need to start down from our cruise altitude to get into the pattern at our airport of destination. Most airplanes use what we call the 3-to-1 rule, meaning that most airplanes, including even large jets, need about 3 nautical miles to lose 1,000 feet of altitude. So we can use that in a little formula to determine what our top of descent is going to be. And the way we do that is we take our cruise altitude and then subtract the pattern altitude, or the altitude which gets us the altitude that we need to lose, and then we multiply the result by 3. And then we move the decimal place on that result over to the left 3-digit, which gives us our result in miles. So for example, if we're cruising at 5,500 feet, which is the altitude I'm going to recommend going down to Greenville, the pattern altitude at Greenville is 1,200 feet, so that means we need to lose 4,300 feet to get down to the pattern altitude in Greenville. If we multiply that times 3, it comes out to 12,900, and then we move the decimal over 3 digits, and that means we need 12.9 miles, or about 13 miles, is where we need to start our descent. So we're about 13 miles out from Greenville. That's when we need to start down to get into the pattern at Greenville. We can also use a formula to determine how fast we need to descend in order to meet that descent kind of restriction there. So to figure out the rate of descent, what you want to do is take your ground speed and divide it by 2, and then multiply that result by 10, and that will give you the number of feet per minute that you need to use to do your descent into your destination airport. So for example, we'll just bump it up to 100 knots, round up to 100 knots of ground speed in the 152. If you divide that by 2, that's 50, and then multiply that by 10, that means we need about a 500 foot per minute rate of descent to start our descent at 13 miles out and make it to the pattern altitude in Greenville. So we can also use that 3-to-1 rule to determine our maximum cruising altitude. It figures that if we're using 3-to-1 to get down, we can also use 3-to-1 to determine the distance that we'll take to get to our cruise altitude from the ground. And so that ends up being 6. So we use that in a formula to determine our maximum cruise altitude. So to figure out your maximum cruise altitude, divide the distance that you're traveling on your route by 6, and then multiply that result by 1,000, and that will give you your maximum cruise altitude. Basically tell you if you have enough distance to get up to a higher cruise altitude before you're going to have to come back down. So for example, our last leg, the one from Camden back to Pine Bluff, is only 53 nautical miles. So if we divide that by 6, we get 8.8, and multiply that times 1,000. That means 8,800 is going to be our maximum cruising altitude. So you can see if we're doing a shorter flight than that, we're not going to want to go up to 8,500 or 9,500 feet. We're just not going to have enough distance to make it up and then descend back down. So that's the formula that we use to determine our maximum cruising altitude. And obviously, if that number comes out to something like 17,000, then you can use pretty much anything you want in a 152. You've got plenty of room to get up and get down. The final topic we need to discuss is correcting for wind. When you're flying in a zero wind condition, things are pretty easy. To fly your course, you just fly your heading, and your ground speed is the same as your true airspeed. But if you have a significant wind, it changes things up a bit. You'll have to fly a slightly different heading to correct for wind drift to fly your course, and you could have a headwind or tailwind component that will change your speed. With a significant crosswind, the wind pushes you in a slightly different direction than your nose is pointed. We already know that your heading is which way your nose is pointed. The path the aircraft flies over the ground is the aircraft's ground track, or track. The difference between the two is called the wind correction angle, or crab angle. If you want to fly using dead reckoning with a significant wind, the best way to make these calculations is to use a flight computer app or website. Old flight computers were called E6Bs, so you can search for that if you're looking for one, or just search for a flight computer app. They should all have a function for heading, ground speed, and wind correction angle. All you have to do is enter the wind speed, wind direction, the aircraft's true airspeed, and the course you want to fly, And the calculator will tell you what heading to fly to maintain your course, how many degrees of wind correction that will be, and what your ground speed will be. So let's take a look at an example using our first leg from Pine Bluff down to Greenville. We know from the course plot that the magnetic course we want to maintain is 131 degrees to get between the two airports. And let's assume that we have a wind out of the west, so 270 degrees, and let's say it's at 25 knots. So that's our wind direction and speed. So let's go take a look at the calculations for that. We need to enter the wind speed at the top, so that's going to be 25 knots. We know it's coming out of the west, 270 degrees. We know the true airspeed of the Cessna 152 at 5,500 feet is going to be 95 knots. And then we know that the magnetic course that we want to fly from that course plot is 131 degrees. And then we hit calculate, and it tells us that the heading we want to fly to maintain our course is going to be 141 degrees. It tells us that that is a wind correction angle of 10 degrees. And then it also tells us that our ground speed with that wind is going to be 112 knots. So we're getting about 17 knots of tailwind component with that wind. Now this is only a factor in Flight Simulator if you put in a significant wind or you use real world weather. If you're flying with calm winds or even light winds, it's not something you need to worry about. You don't need to do these calculations. You can just fly your heading and it should take you where you want to go. Also mentioned that flight computers have all sorts of useful functions that you can use in Flight Simulator. You can see they can do conversions. We talked about the heading, ground speed, and wind correction angle. You can also calculate your true airspeed, runway crosswinds, fuel consumptions, do calculations for how much time it's going to take to fly a leg with a certain ground speed. So there's all sorts of functions that you can actually use in Flight Simulator, and this is just one that I've got on my phone. And so they're well worth your time to look into getting one of those. If I would use probably one of the free ones, but all those have plenty of functions that you can use that would come in handy in Flight Simulator. So to set up for the flight, we want to set up just like we've set up for every flight, going left to right, except this time we're going to throw in a flight plan. So we do want the Cessna 152. We do want 2 full tanks of gas. It seems like with the latest update, it is saying we are overweight or over a limit, even though we're at a limit. So that's okay. We want 188 pounds of fuel, and we have 188 pounds of fuel, and that's the limit. So that's just fine. Then we want to select our departure, like we talked about in the flight planning section. So we'll go to Pine Bluff. I'm going to start on runway 18. If you want to start at the ramp, that's fine as well. Then we'll pick our destination airport. So that's going to be Kilo Golf Lima Hotel for Greenville. We'll select that. And then for runway, I'm going to use 18 right, so we don't have to cross over runways, and I'm going to do a straight in. I'm not going to put the GPS final approach fix in there for this flight. I'm just going to make it go straight between the airports. But since Dumas Airport is right on the route there, I'm going to go ahead and add that so we have a position port to look at or a position point to look at on the map on the way down there. As far as flight conditions and that sort of setup, we'll go ahead and set it up for, again, a June day around the 22nd, around solstice, and noon is fine. Although if you want to do like a 10 o'clock departure, that's fine, but we should have plenty of daylight to get a round trip back to Pine Bluff. And we'll delete the wind layer, but again, you'll have to go in and delete this when you get in the simulator, and bring the temperature up to about 25 degrees Celsius and standard pressure. All looks good, so we'll go ahead and fly. So one last thing we want to do before we take off is take a look at the data for the airport that we're going to land at. And so here it is on the sectional chart that provides some data. There's Greenville, Mid-Delta, GLH, and we can tell because it's a blue airport and the data box is blue that it is a controlled airport, so it does have a controlled tower frequency that we can use if we want to do that. Also tells us that it has a weather station that we can listen into if we didn't set the weather, but we are going to set the weather today. It tells us that the field elevation is 131 feet, that the runways are lighted, the longest runway is 8,000 feet long, and it also tells us that it has a right pattern from runway 18 right and runway 36 right. So we'll need to take that into consideration as we think about making a pattern entry down there. We'll also check the airport facility directory data for the airport because that's going to give us some good information. I've highlighted some of the things we'll want to look at. Obviously, it's got a little mini airport diagram, which is going to help us see the layout of the field. You have 2 parallel runways and then some taxiways going off, and then your ramps are over in this area. And then, of course, this area with the X's is closed, as are these taxiways, so we can't use any of those. Need to be aware of that. It tells us that the airport's 5 miles to the northeast of the city, so if we can find the city, we want to look northeast to try to find the airport. Then it gives us data on the runways. So for runway 18 left, 36 right, which is this one over here, it tells us it's 8,001 feet long by 150 feet wide. It's made of asphalt, and that's going to kind of tell you in Flight Simulator what the color of the runway probably should be. Asphalt is generally going to be black versus concrete is usually going to be a gray or whitish color. Tells you it's grooved, which is that's where it has grooves on the runway to help drainage when it's raining. So your braking action is probably going to be a little bit better. Also tells us that it has runway lighting, high intensity runway lighting. Also tells us that it has approach lighting, which we can also see here in the airport diagram. And then for runway 18 right, tells us that one is 7,019 feet long by 150 feet wide. So still a good sized runway, asphalt and concrete, and it is also grooved. It also tells us that the 18 right approach in has a PAPI and tells us data about that. Also lets us know that it's right traffic for that runway. So that's going to be a factor if we're going to go into the traffic pattern down there. Airport remarks, it tells us that the runway 18 right, 36 left markings are faded, and this does actually get some play in Flight Simulator. I believe the designation markings are missing on this runway, so you see that when we get down there. And then it gives us information on the nav aids at the airport. So the VOR DME is down there. It's on this frequency. There's the identifier and its location, and then it tells us to get from the VOR to the field. We fly heading 179, so we go south for 2.4 miles, and that takes us to the airport. So that's all information that we want to look at and review before we take off for the airport we're planning to land on. So once I'm on the runway here, I can access my VFR map by clicking on this icon. And then usually I'll set that up so it's over kind of on the top right of the screen, and I can zoom in and out there and see where I'm going there. I'm not going to use the VFR map for this. We're just going to try to use charts and headings and pilotage and on this leg. And then if I want to access the navlog, I go to the compass looking icon here, and that'll pull up the navlog. And again, I'll put that over on the left hand side, but you can tell it gives us the name of the next fix we're navigating to, and it tells us the heading we need to fly to get there. So once we get airborne, we need to take up a heading of 130 degrees, and it's 26 miles, so it should take us about 15 minutes to get there, maybe a little more with our climb. So if we want to time and see when we're getting there, we can do that. All right, so once you've got all that set up to where you can look at it easily, let's see here. Actually, you can also hit N, and you'll get the navlog up, and you can hit V, and that will pull up the VFR map. If you just want to do that with keys, you can do that as well. So once you've got all that set up and you're ready to go ahead and do a before takeoff checklist, and it's time to get airborne. To perform this flight, perform a normal takeoff from runway 18 at Pine Bluff. At 500 feet above the ground, or about 700 feet on your altimeter, go ahead and turn a modified crosswind kind of departure turn. Instead of turning to 090 for the crosswind leg, we'll turn to a heading of 130, which is our on-course heading for Greenville. So we're climbing through about 3,700 feet on our way up to 5,500 feet. You'll notice once we get above about 2,000 feet or so, we get a pretty good view of the river off to the left side here. And as long as we keep the river in sight, that's the Arkansas River, and it's going to flow into the Mississippi River. As long as we keep that river in sight, we really shouldn't get lost on this flight. At 5,500 feet, go ahead and perform a normal level off and allow the aircraft to accelerate. You may notice that the aircraft accelerates a little more sluggishly at this altitude than it did at the lower altitudes where we practiced maneuvers. So once you've got yourself leveled off and trimmed out and have the engine set about 2,300 RPM, we only want to go through the leaning procedure. So the way we do that, it's kind of a crude method in the 152, but it's effective. Keep an eye on your RPMs. What we're going to do is we're just going to pull the mixture control back. You can pull it quickly back to about 50%, and then slowly pull it back until you start to see a drop in the engine RPMs, and listen for the engine sound as well. So there we got a little drop in RPM, so we'll push it a little rich of that, and about 36% should work. And then, so that's how we lean out the engine in the 152. You just pull it back until your engine starts to lose power a little bit, and then you push it back until you're back at your original power setting. This will be part of our cruise procedure, cruise checklist. We'll lean the mixture, and then the other thing we need to do is line the gyro, because even though we have the settings on Flight Simulator set to not process, it still processes a little bit. It still wanders off of what heading it should be on. So all you have to do to correct that is hit the D key. So our checklist is mixture is leaned, heading indicator is aligned, and our cruise checklist is complete. And once you've done your cruise procedure, now it's just a matter of holding your heading and looking for landmarks. And if you, you're holding your heading of 130, and if you drift off of your heading by 10 or 15 degrees for, even up to a minute, really on a short VFR flight like this where we've got lots of landmarks, it's not going to make that big of a difference. So you don't have to be super precise with your heading. Plus or minus 10 degrees is going to be just fine. It's going to get you where you want to go. And again, use the landmarks to kind of reference. Speaking of landmarks, don't be afraid to use the translate option on the flight simulator to move yourself around the cockpit. If you go over to the right hand side of the cockpit, you can get a better look at what's kind of underneath you and the landmarks that are on that side, and then use the different views, including behind you, to take a look around at what's out there. Again, we're following the river out there. We can also see the highway out there, a little thin line going through the fields there, and that is US 65, and we know that once that goes kind of under the nose, right about up there, that we're approaching Dumas, our first fix. And if you want to, you can go ahead and bring the VFR map up, and we can see we're actually, even though we haven't been using the map to stay on course, we're pretty darn close to the course. And we're getting close to our first waypoint there, our only waypoint on this leg of Dumas. So looking at the landmarks out my nose right now, again, there's US 65 coming down, and as we get a little closer to the town, we can see that Dumas is out there. And the airport is off to, let's see here, the east of the city, so it should be over here somewhere, so we can look at that. Another thing you can do is use the translate forward to kind of cram your nose into the windshield up here and look for things. In fact, look, there is Dumas Airport right there, it looks like. And so we know we are on course and getting close to our first checkpoint. Another thing I'll mention that is in an actual private pilot check ride during the cross-country portion of the check ride, your altitude tolerances are widened a little bit. Instead of getting the plus or minus 100 feet that you get in normal maneuvers, you get plus or minus 200 feet. And this is because the examiner knows that you're going to be doing things like looking on charts, looking out for waypoints, things that can take your attention away from the aircraft. So those tolerances are a little bit wider, which is appropriate in the 152 because you're hand flying the entire time. You don't have any sort of autopilot. When you get to an aircraft that does have an autopilot, then you do want to tighten up your tolerances a little bit. And I'll also mention, you'll notice we're flying over the town of Dumas is coming off here to our left, but we're not going to be able to see when we cross directly over the airport because the airport's going to go underneath the airplane. So we'll have to know that once we're being the town, we're crossing over the airport, and that's our checkpoint. Not as important on this leg, but it becomes more important when we get to the dead reckoning legs. So as we cross over Dumas, we can see the Arkansas River flowing to the southwest here, and then we can see the Mississippi flowing there, and so we can see the portion where the confluence there over to our left of our nose there. And then as it flows onto the south here, I'll raise my nose up a little bit here, we can see that point where the Mississippi bows out to the west a little bit, and that's what we marked as our top of descent point on our charts. So when we get to that area up there, that's where we're going to want to start our descent into Greenville. So as we get about 10 or 15 miles further along course past Dumas, if we look over to the left here, again we can see the confluence over here of the Arkansas and the Mississippi. And then if we look forward, again we can see the point where the river bows out to the west, and that's going to be when we get a beam that'll be our top of descent, and then Greenville should be straight off our nose and up about just a little bit under the horizon there. So that's what we're looking at for landmarks at this point. Okay, so we're passing a beam, the bow in the river right now. Actually, let's see here, I'll slide over to the left side of the cockpit here, and we can see there's kind of the beam point, so that's where we want to start our descent. So I'll go ahead and throw the carburetor heat on, and then reduce the engine RPMs to about 1900 feet, and we want to keep our cruise airspeed, so just go ahead and pitch for that cruise airspeed, and then adjust your power so that it gets the descent rate. And you need about roughly 500 feet a minute, so you can actually use a little bit more power than that, and that should start us a nice descent into the field. And Greenville should be up about 5 miles past the river here, so we'll start looking out for the airport now. Another thing I'll mention as we start our descent is we want to start enriching the mixture as we come down, and probably 10 or 15% per 1,000 feet, so I'll go ahead and bump it up to about 50 or so. And then as we come through, we're coming through 4,500 now, as we come through 3,500, I'll bump it up to probably 60, 65. And the goal is, of course, to have it full rich by the time we land. All right, so we're coming through about 2,500 feet, just a little over 1,000 feet to go to pattern altitude, and we're starting to pick up Greenville Airport right there. We can see the 2 runways and the ramp. The airports can be difficult to find in Flight Simulator, just like they can be in real life, so you want to look for clues on your sectional as to where you're going to find it. If I look over here to the south here, I can see this pretty good bend in the river where it bends off to the east, and then the town of Greenville is right over there, and then I know the airport is to the north and the east of the town. So that's one way I can find it. You can also look for airport beacons, since those are operational 24/7 in Flight Simulator, and they actually have the approach lights on at some of these airports, so you can also look for those. The way I'm going to enter the pattern is I'm going to basically turn base along this road and then make kind of a straight in here. But if you wanted to, you could fly down to the south and then make a 45-degree entry for the right pattern under 18 right, or you could fly over the field and then do your 45-degree entry for runway 18 left. Right now, coming through about 2,000 feet, I want to make sure that my lights are back on. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my mixture is full rich. I'm a little high, so I'm going to go ahead and pull off the power a little more and come on down into the traffic pattern altitude. And then once I get down probably around 1,200 feet, we'll just set up for a normal landing, just like we did going into Lancaster. So again, if you find yourself high, you're absolutely no problem in pulling power off. You know, just get yourself on down if you find yourself a little bit high. And of course, you know, if you got plenty of gas, you can always make a turn away from the airport, make a circle to lose a little bit of altitude here. So I'm turning out to the east, heading of about 090 here, and I'll get down to 1,200 feet, and then I'll start configuring for the approach. All right, so as I come up on 1,200 feet or pattern altitude, I'm just going to level off with my pitch and let the airspeed bleed off and start configuring for the approach. So there's 1,200 feet, so I'm going to pitch about nose level here and let the airspeed start to bleed off. There's 85 knots, so go and bring out the first notch of flaps. Pitch for about 80 here for a second. And we'll go ahead and bring out that second notch of flaps and pitch for about 70 knots. And then we'll start our turn to final. Looking for about 300 or 400 feet per minute, but I'm probably just a little bit high, so probably a little more than that. Again, pitch for airspeed and power for descent rate. There's 18 left. We're looking for 18 right, and there it is. It's not too high. Rolling out on final here, we'll go ahead and bring our final notch of flaps in and pitch for about 60 knots. And try to get back down on that glide slope. But you can see our nose is pointed at about the aiming point markers, about that 1,000-foot mark. So we're not too high. And go ahead and trim for that pitch so it flies that. We'll do a quick before landing checklist. The landing light and taxi lights are on. Carb heat's on, the mixture's full rich, and the flaps are 30, so the before landing checklist is complete. And from here we just roll it on for a normal landing. Looks like you're getting on a more normal glide slope now, so I'm going to bring some power back on. There's the VASI, looking good. And then just like we do with our normal landings in the pattern or out there in Lancaster, come over the threshold here, and we'll pull the power off, and then do a flare. Also no center line on this runway. Alright, looks like we got a taxiway coming up there off the right. So when we get close to that taxiway center line marker there, we can put on some brakes and get down to a reasonable taxi speed. And once you've cleared the runway, go ahead and perform your after landing checklist. And once you get off the runway, if you can find your marshaller, you can go ahead and park at that spot. You don't have to park there. Obviously, there's a big ramp here, and you're not, tied to parking to that space. But go ahead and follow the marshaller's direction, and make sure you're nice and slow as you come into the parking area. Follow their signals. Oops, started a little short there. And then go ahead and park, and then conduct your shutdown checklist. So that takes care of the first leg of our cross country. On the next leg and in the next lesson, we'll take a look at a pure dead reckoning leg. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.